There was no moment more dangerous in ancient China than the one that was supposed to be the most natural. They were not simply giving birth. They were not simply bringing a child into the world. They were navigating a system so layered, so ancient, so loaded with obligation, ritual, and invisible expectation, that the woman lying on a reed mat in a darkened inner chamber was not just a mother. She was a vessel of lineage, a threshold between the living and the dead, a point where the cosmic order either held or fractured. People think of childbirth as a private moment, a biological event, something intimate, enclosed within the walls of a single family. But in ancient China, nothing was truly private, not even this. The child who entered the world did not belong to its mother. Not entirely. It belonged to the clan, to the ancestors whose tablets stood in the inner hall, to the father who would determine whether it was worth keeping, to the state that would one day register its name, count its body among the productive living, and calculate what it owed in grain, in labor, in loyalty. Understanding what it meant to give birth in ancient China means understanding something most people instinctively resist: that the body of a woman in labor was not hers alone. It was a site of inheritance, a mechanism of continuity. And the forces that governed what happened in that room, who attended, what was said, what rituals were performed, what was done if something went wrong, were not decided by the woman herself. They were decided by centuries. When you understand that, you will never look at this period the same way again. Se esse tipo de história faz você enxergar o passado com mais profundidade, considere se inscrever. Esses roteiros levam tempo para construir e ainda existem muitas histórias esperando para serem contadas. To understand the birth, you must first understand the house. In the villages and towns of ancient China, across the long centuries that stretched from the Zhou through the Han, the family home was not simply a shelter. It was a cosmological map. The outer gate faced the street and the world of men, commerce, officials, dust, obligation. The inner courtyard was where the household breathed, and in the deepest interior rooms, behind screens and partition walls, lived the women of the family, the wives, the concubines, the daughters-in-law, the grandmothers, in a world that had its own hierarchies, its own economy of influence, its own unspoken rules. The architecture itself enforced order. A proper household was organized around the principle that what was most valued was kept most protected. Grain was stored in sealed granaries. Ritual objects were locked in wooden chests, and women, particularly women of childbearing age, were kept in the interior, away from the contaminating disorder of the outer world. The walls were timber-framed, plastered with earth, sometimes whitewashed. The roofs curved upward at the corners to deflect malevolent spirits. In the central hall stood the ancestral tablets, carved wooden plaques inscribed with the names of those who had come before, objects of daily reverence, incense and offerings placed before them at dawn and dusk. These were not decorations. They were the presence of the dead among the living, and the living organized their behavior accordingly. Outside the walls, the fields stretched in every direction. In the north, millet and sorghum. In the south, rice, flooded paddies that demanded communal labor, shared water rights, cooperative timing. The agricultural calendar was sacred. The seasons did not bend to human need. Planting, flooding, harvesting. These rhythms organized everything, including when it was auspicious to conceive, when it was dangerous to travel, when a woman approaching her final month should withdraw from fieldwork entirely and remain within the household. The economy of a farming family in ancient China was a calculus of bodies. Every person was a unit of labor. Every child born was a future investment, but also an immediate cost. Feeding an infant through its helpless years, clothing it, keeping it alive through the killing cold of northern winters or the fevers of southern summers, required resources the family might not have. And so even before a child arrived, its value was being silently calculated. This was not cruelty. It was mathematics. It was survival. The clan, the extended network of families sharing a common surname and a common ancestral line, was the structure above the household. In many villages, a single clan dominated entirely. Their ancestral hall stood at the center of the settlement, larger than any private home, used for ceremonies, dispute resolution, collective feasts, and the registration of births. When a child was born, the event was not complete until it was acknowledged by the clan. Until then, the child existed in a kind of threshold state, present in the world, but not yet fully real within the social order. And beneath all of this, beneath the household, the clan, the agricultural cycle, the ancestral obligations, ran something older and harder to name. A belief that the world was not divided into the natural and the supernatural, but was instead a single continuous fabric of force and response. Heaven above, earth below, human beings in between, responsible for maintaining the harmony between them. Pregnancy was not a medical condition. It was a cosmological event. When a woman missed her monthly flow, the first person she told was rarely her husband. It was her mother-in-law. This detail reveals everything. In the household hierarchy of ancient China, a young wife occupied one of the most precarious positions in the entire social order. She had left her birth family, severed, in a very real sense, from the clan that had raised her, and entered a new household as an outsider. Her status was conditional. Her belonging was provisional. She was valued for what she could produce: obedience, labor, and above all, sons. A pregnancy changed her position immediately, not because it made her powerful, but because it made her necessary. And necessity, in ancient China, was the closest thing to protection that a woman of modest standing could claim. The mother-in-law's response mattered enormously. She was the sovereign of the inner quarters. She controlled the food, the daily schedule, the relationships between the women of the household. If she was pleased, if the pregnancy was welcomed, the young wife would find herself receiving better food, lighter duties, a warmer sleeping place in winter. If she was not pleased, for reasons that ranged from the practical to the superstitious to the purely personal, the pregnancy would unfold in a climate of anxiety that could affect both mother and child in ways that people at the time understood viscerally, even if they could not have explained them in modern terms. What nobody expected, or rather, what everyone expected but no one said aloud, was how much of the pregnancy would be governed not by any individual person, but by a dense web of prohibitions that had accumulated over centuries. These were called taijiao in their broadest sense, the education or conditioning of the fetus. The idea was not primitive. It was, in its own logic, sophisticated. The belief was that the mother's experiences, her emotions, her diet, her moral conduct, and even the things she looked at during pregnancy would directly shape the character and physical form of the child growing inside her. This was not metaphor. It was taken as literal mechanism. A pregnant woman was forbidden from eating certain foods. Rabbit meat, for instance, was avoided in some traditions because it was feared the child would be born with a cleft lip. She was discouraged from attending funerals or stepping over ropes or rope-like objects. She was not to witness executions, arguments, or scenes of violence. She was advised to look at beautiful things, jade objects, paintings of landscapes, the idealized faces of virtuous ancestors. She was to read, or have read, to her texts of moral instruction, so that the child would absorb virtue before it was even born. She was to control her emotions with extraordinary discipline. Excessive grief was dangerous. Excessive joy was dangerous. Fear was dangerous. Anger was especially dangerous. It was believed to agitate the fetal spirit, disrupting the delicate balance that allowed a child to form properly. Imagine what this meant in practice. A young woman, already under the constant surveillance of her mother-in-law, already navigating the invisible hierarchies of the inner quarters, now carrying an obligation not just to behave correctly, but to feel correctly. Her interior life was no longer her own. Even her emotions had become a form of duty. The system had a cost, and yet it also had a logic that was, in its way, compassionate. The restrictions on heavy labor were real protections. A woman in her final months was genuinely excused from the most physically brutal work of the household and the fields. The emphasis on good food, when the family could afford it, reflected a genuine understanding that the health of the mother affected the health of the child. The prohibition on emotional extremes was, beneath its ritual framing, an instruction to the household. Do not cause this woman distress. Do not bring her into conflict. Protect her from shock and grief. What looked like control was also, sometimes, a form of care. What looked like restriction was also, sometimes, a form of shelter. This is the paradox that runs through almost every institution in ancient China. The same structure that constrained a life could also be the structure that preserved it. As the pregnancy advanced, the household reorganized itself around it in ways that were both practical and ceremonial. The woman's sleeping arrangements were reconsidered. She was to face a favorable direction, to sleep on a firm surface, to avoid positions that might disturb the child's positioning in the womb. Experienced women in the household, grandmothers, senior wives, sometimes a skilled neighbor, would observe the shape of the belly, the coloring of the mother's face, the quality of her appetite, and offer interpretations. Was the belly high and rounded? Perhaps a sun. Was the mother's complexion acquiring a particular luminosity? A good sign. Was she craving sour things, or sweet things, or salty things? Each had its traditional reading. These were not idle superstitions. They were a collective system of attention, a way for the community of women in the inner quarters to participate in something that mattered enormously to all of them. Because the birth of a healthy son did not only benefit the mother, it strengthened the household, it pleased the ancestors, it secured the lineage, it elevated, however slightly, the standing of every woman associated with that birth. The midwife, when one was called, occupied a peculiar social position. She was not a physician. In ancient China, formal medical knowledge was largely a male domain, codified in texts, transmitted through lineages of scholars and court physicians who theorized about the flow of qi through the body's channels, about the balance of yin and yang, about the influence of the 5 phases on health and disease. Obstetrics existed within this theoretical framework, but the actual work of birth, the hands-on, blood and breath reality of it, belonged to women who learned through practice, through apprenticeship, through accumulated experience passed mouth to ear across generations. The midwife knew things that no text recorded. She knew how to turn a child lying badly in the womb. She knew which herbs, boiled in water, and administered carefully, could slow dangerous bleeding or encourage a labor that was stalling. She knew how to read the pace of contractions, how to position a woman's body, how to speak in a voice that steadied rather than frightened. She also knew, with a clarity that no ritual could soften, that sometimes nothing she did would be enough. The room where a woman gave birth was deliberately separated from the rest of the household. Not out of privacy, out of pollution. In the cosmological architecture of ancient China, birth, like death, was a moment of radical threshold crossing. Something was entering the world from a place beyond the world. The boundary between the ordered human realm and the formless beyond was, for a brief and violent interval, open. And open boundaries, in a system built entirely on the maintenance of proper boundaries, were dangerous by definition. The birth room was considered ritually impure. The blood, the fluids, the raw biological extremity of the process. These were not simply messy. They were cosmologically disruptive. Men of the household, particularly the husband and the father-in-law, were expected to remain far from the room. The ancestral tablets in the central hall were sometimes screened or covered during the birth, so that the ancestors would not be exposed to the contaminating force of the event. This was not contempt for women or for birth. It was, within its own logic, a form of reverence. The moment was so charged, so liminal, so saturated with invisible forces, that it had to be cordoned off from the normal functioning of the household. The women attending the birth, the midwife, the mother-in-law, if she chose to be present, other experienced women of the household or neighborhood, formed a closed circle around the laboring woman. What happened inside that circle was their domain entirely. The woman in labor did not lie on a bed in the way that seems obvious to a modern mind. In many traditions, she was upright or semi-upright, supported by the arms of attendants or by a rope suspended from a ceiling beam, her body working with gravity rather than against it. The floor beneath her was spread with fresh straw or rushes. A brazier burned nearby for warmth and for the heating of water. Herbs smoldered in the coals, some for their practical properties, some for their ability to drive away the malevolent spirits that were drawn, it was believed, to the openness of threshold moments, because spirits were present at a birth. Everyone understood this, not as metaphor, as operational reality. The most feared was a class of entities that preyed specifically on newborns and on women weakened by labor. Difficult births were sometimes understood as the result of spiritual interference, a malevolent presence blocking the child's passage, tangling the cord, stealing the breath. The midwife's role was therefore not only physical but ritual. She might recite protective formulas. She might hang specific objects near the doorway. She might burn particular materials whose smoke was believed to repel harmful forces. What nobody in that room doubted, not the midwife, not the grandmother pressing a damp cloth to the laboring woman's forehead, not the young wife gripping the rope and forcing herself to breathe, was that they were not alone. The ancestors were near. The spirits were near. The forces that governed life and death were present in the room, closer than the walls. This awareness did not make the pain smaller, but it made it meaningful. Pain in ancient China was not simply a medical event. It was a moral and cosmological one. Suffering had a place in the order of things. It was not arbitrary. It was not evidence of a universe indifferent to human experience. It was, within the framework that every person in that room had absorbed since childhood, a moment of passage, a cost extracted by the threshold itself. The woman who labored understood that what she was doing mattered beyond her own body. She was maintaining the lineage. She was fulfilling the first and most fundamental obligation of a wife. She was producing the human material upon which the entire structure of the family, and, scaled upward, the clan, the state, the cosmic order, depended. But there was a problem. The same system that gave her suffering meaning also stripped her of agency at the most critical moment. The decision about what to do if the labor went catastrophically wrong was not hers to make. It was not even the midwife's to make alone. A situation severe enough to threaten the mother's life would eventually require the household, meaning the senior men of the household, to be consulted. And the calculus of that consultation was not simply about saving the mother. It was about which life was more valuable to the continuity of the family. A wife could, in theory, be replaced. A son, particularly a firstborn son, particularly in a family without male heirs, represented something irreplaceable. This was not a secret. It was structural. The entire philosophical and legal architecture of the family in ancient China was organized around patrilineal descent. The son carried the surname. The son performed the ancestral rites. The son inherited the land, maintained the household, cared for aging parents, and ensured that the dead would continue to receive offerings. Without a son, the line ended. The ancestors went hungry. The family dissolved. This is why the sex of the child mattered so profoundly, and why the moments immediately following birth were among the most charged in any family's life. When the child finally came, when the midwife received it in practiced hands and the room held its breath, the first thing everyone registered was whether it was crying. Silence was the sound of catastrophe. A strong cry meant life. It meant breath had entered. It meant the spirit had chosen to inhabit the body. It meant, for the exhausted woman on the straw-covered floor, that the ordeal had produced something, that the suffering had resolved into continuation. The cord was cut with a blade, the specific implement sometimes chosen with care, sometimes simply whatever was at hand. The child was wrapped quickly in cloth that had been warmed near the fire. The midwife examined it with experienced eyes, the color of the skin, the shape of the limbs, the clarity of the features. And then came the moment that modern sensibility finds most difficult to hold. The father was informed, and the father decided. In ancient China, the act that completed a birth, the act that transformed a biological event into a social fact, was the father's acknowledgement. This was called, in its most formal expression, the recognition of the child. The father would lift the child, literally raise it from the ground, as a gesture of acceptance. If he lifted it, the child was part of the family. It would be fed, named, registered, counted among the living. If he did not lift it, the child could be exposed. Exposure, the abandonment of a newborn left outside the household walls, was not illegal in the way that a modern person would immediately expect. It occupied a complex moral and legal space. It was condemned by some philosophical voices. It was tacitly accepted by others as a grim necessity of poverty. It fell most heavily on girls, daughters who would leave the family at marriage, who would perform ancestral rites for another clan's dead, who would never carry the surname forward. The system was functioning exactly as it had been designed, not with malice, with a ruthless coherence. A family with insufficient land to divide, insufficient grain to survive the winter, insufficient sons to perform the labor the fields required. That family made calculations that the system had trained it to make. The individual father making the decision was not a villain. He was a node in a network of obligations, shortages, and inherited beliefs so old that questioning them would have seemed not just impractical, but genuinely incomprehensible. What looked like a personal choice was the system choosing. If the child was lifted, the world changed. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, not immediately. The change was quiet, almost administrative in its first expressions, but it was absolute. The moment the father's hands closed around the infant and raised it from the ground, a chain of consequences was set in motion that would follow that child for the rest of its life, and in some senses, beyond it. The first days were still dangerous. Everyone understood this. The mortality of newborns in ancient China was not an abstraction. It was a presence in every household, a shadow that every family had learned to live beside. Infants died of cold. They died of fever. They died of infections that entered through the cord stump. They died of the sheer fragility of new existence in a world that did not soften itself for the newly arrived. And so the household did not celebrate immediately. There was a waiting period, a threshold of days during which the child proved, through the simple act of continuing to breathe, that it intended to stay. The third day was significant. On the third day, in many traditions, the child was given its first ritual bath. This was not merely hygienic, it was ceremonial. The water was prepared carefully, sometimes infused with herbs chosen for protective properties, sometimes warmed to a precise temperature, judged by the experienced hands of the women attending. The bathing was accompanied by words, wishes, protective formulas, invocations of auspicious forces. The grandmother might press a piece of silver or a small jade object into the water so that its virtue would pass into the child's skin. The child was being introduced to the world in stages. First, the physical world, air, warmth, the sensation of held hands. Then, the social world, the women of the household, who would shape its earliest experience of human contact. Then, gradually, the ritual world, the web of meaning and obligation into which it had been born. The full name would come later. In many traditions, a child was not given its formal name for 100 days. Before that, it was called by a milk name, a soft, informal sound, often deliberately humble or even slightly unflattering, chosen to deceive malevolent spirits into overlooking the child as unworthy of their attention. If you did not name a thing properly, the logic went, you had not yet fully claimed it, and what had not been fully claimed was harder to take. This was the same logic that governed the ancestral tablets. A person became fully real, fully integrated into the fabric of family and cosmos, only through a sequence of ritual acknowledgments. Birth alone was not enough. Survival was not enough. The child had to be named, registered, recognized, and eventually incorporated into the ancestral line through its own adult conduct. It was a system that created persons gradually, deliberately, through accumulated acts of social confirmation. The mother, in the days following birth, occupied a state that was simultaneously honored and constrained. She had done what was required of her. If the child was a son, her position in the household had shifted perceptibly. The mother-in-law's tone might be warmer. Her food portions might be more generous. The other women of the household might look at her with a different quality of attention, one that acknowledged, without needing to say so directly, that she had crossed a threshold they all recognized as fundamental. But she was also considered depleted in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. The birth had disturbed her internal balance. Her qi had been expended, her blood had been lost, the careful equilibrium of forces that constituted a healthy body had been disrupted. The postpartum period was therefore treated as a time of mandatory recovery and mandatory seclusion. In some traditions, this period lasted a month. In others, longer. During this time, the new mother ate specific foods, chosen to rebuild what the birth had consumed. Warm foods, in the framework of Chinese medical thinking, foods that generated internal heat, restored the blood, strengthened the digestive system that was understood as the root of all vitality. Millet congee, egg preparations, soups made from bones simmered for hours. Sometimes wine, warmed and taken in small quantities, believed to improve circulation and drive out the cold that was thought to have entered the body during labor. She was not to bathe in cold water. She was not to expose herself to wind. She was not to read or strain her eyes. She was not to cry. The loss of tears was a loss of fluid the body could not afford. She was, in the most literal sense, being rebuilt. And as she was rebuilt, the child was simultaneously being constructed, socially, ritually, cosmologically. The two processes ran in parallel, each dependent on the other. The mother's recovery determined her ability to nurse. Her ability to nurse determined the child's survival. The child's survival determined the family's continuation. The family's continuation determined whether the ancestors would be properly honored. Whether the ancestors were properly honored determined whether heaven's favor would rest on the household. Everything was connected. Nothing was isolated. This is what the system understood about itself, even if no single person within it could have articulated it in precisely those terms. The women in the inner quarters, the midwife with her herbs and her formulas, the father waiting outside, the grandmother heating water over the brazier. They were all performing roles in a drama whose script had been written across generations, refined by necessity, sanctified by repetition, until it felt not like a human construction, but like the natural order of things. The registration of the birth, when it occurred, moved the child from the domestic world into the administrative one. In the more organized periods of Chinese imperial history, household registers were maintained by local officials. Every person counted was a person the state could tax, conscript, and govern. A child added to the register became, in a sense, a subject, claimed not only by the family and the clan and the ancestors, but by the apparatus of the empire itself. This moment is easy to overlook. It seems bureaucratic, procedural, but it was, in its way, the final act of the birth sequence, the point at which a private biological event was absorbed into the public order. The child who had emerged from the threshold space of the birth room, who had been lifted by its father's hands, bathed, given a milk name, nursed through its dangerous first days, was now a number in a register, a unit in the imperial count, a body that belonged, at the most fundamental level, to the largest structure of all. The family had produced what the state required. The ancestors had received a new descendant. The lineage had been extended by one, and the woman who had made all of this possible, who had endured the months of restriction, the surveillance of her emotions, the physical extremity of labor, the vulnerability of the postpartum period, returned to her place in the household. Perhaps a slightly more secure place than before. Perhaps with a warmer tone in the voice of the woman who controlled her daily life. Perhaps with the knowledge that she had fulfilled the obligation for which she had been brought into this family. But the system did not pause to acknowledge what that had cost her. Systems rarely do. What happened in that darkened room, in that inner courtyard, in that village or town or imperial city across the long centuries of ancient China, was not simply birth. It was the reproduction of an entire civilization. Every child that survived was a confirmation that the system worked. Every ritual performed was the system teaching itself to its newest members before they were even old enough to understand what was being taught. The mechanisms that governed conception, pregnancy, labor, and the first days of life were not incidental features of ancient Chinese society. They were the society, in miniature, in its most intimate expression. The hierarchy of the household was the hierarchy of the state reflected inward. The authority of the ancestors over the living was the authority of tradition over innovation. The vulnerability of the newborn was the vulnerability of any individual within a system that valued continuity above all else. And here is what endures across the distance of centuries. The tension between the individual body and the collective demand never resolved. It persisted. It found new forms, new justifications, new administrative languages. But the fundamental structure, that a person is born into obligations they did not choose, within a system that was running long before they arrived and will continue running long after they are gone. That structure is not ancient Chinese. That structure is human. The woman on the straw mat, gripping the rope, breathing through the force of something larger than herself, was not a figure from a remote and alien past. She was every person who has ever brought a child into a world they did not design. Every person who has fulfilled a role the world assigned them before they were old enough to question it. Every person who has looked at the system that shaped them and understood, with a clarity that arrives only in extremity, that they are both its product and its price. The cord was cut. The child cried. The household exhaled, and the system continued.